Hello everyone, my name is Kyle, and today I'm going to be talking about the COGS108 group project for Group 13. So me and my group, including Alec, Gavin, Jay, and Daniel, wanted to explore how the patterns in our smartphone use, more specifically how apps are opened over time, might be linked to stress and academic performance. And so what we studied was, what we looked at was a pattern called burstiness. Now, to imagine burstiness, I'll give you an example. Let's say there's one student who checks their phone evenly throughout the day, say every hour or two, and the other checks 10 different apps in the span of 5 minutes, then doesn't touch their phone for hours, and then touches it again. That second student is showing a high burstiness, meaning they use their phone in tight, clustered bursts, whereas the first student is showing a low burstiness. Now, our hypothesis was as follows. Based on prior work, firstly, prior work on how the relationship between phone use and academic levels of GPA and stress did not really focus on temporal patterns of phone use, and rather tried to, you know, rather assume that screen time wasn't inherently good or bad. But what we're looking at is whether or not, whether how people engage with their phones might give us deeper insight into stress and performance. And our hypothesis was that people with more bursty patterns of phone use, opening apps in tight clusters, would be more stressed and have lower GPAs. Now, we used the student life data set, which had app usage logs from 48 users who went to Dartmouth College, and they self-reported their stress levels in the form of perceived stress scale and their academic performance and GPAs. And basically what happened was the conductors of the study put out a survey and had 48 students respond to it and log these values in. And what we find is that, the data set mostly contains these background applications from which we cannot really discern the exact applications that people are using, but nevertheless, we still calculate the burstiness, the average burstiness from this data. And so what we found was, we calculated the total hours with phone unlocked and the average time per unlocked session, and we found that the majority spent a total of 800 hours on their phone, whereas the average unlocked time per session was time per unlocked session, was around like 3 hours, with a few outliers that are above 20, but that's only 2 students. Now, what did we find when comparing burstiness to both GPA and stress? Well, first let's talk about stress, because comparing burstiness with stress scores, we expected more bursty behavior to increase stress, but surprisingly, we saw a very small negative correlation of negative 0.238, as we can see in this graph here, which kind of conflicts with our hypothesis, because what this correlation coefficient means is that students who use their phones in short bursts tend to report slightly less stress. And while not statistically significant, it's still contradictory to our hypothesis. We also found similar results with burstiness versus GPA, and with a nearly flat result of a correlation of just 0.057, as described in our conclusion. And so, yes, that is our hypothesis. We found that our hypothesis was untrue, and that, stress does not increase with burstiness, and GPA does not necessarily decrease with burstiness. And to be fair, there were a lot of issues with the data. In the ethics and privacy session, the participants were exclusively Dartmouth College students, representing a narrower socioeconomic and educational range. The data was collected back in 2013, when many modern apps weren't in use. There was only Android users that participated in the survey, nothing on iOS users. And, our data set was just 48 students, which isn't necessarily enough to make a definitive statement about the relationship between burstiness and GPA and stress scores, but still, it's a very, we continued on with it. Now, looking ahead, as described in our conclusion, even with these limitations, our study provides a solid baseline for future research, which should, per our recommendation, Break down burstiness by app category, like social versus educational apps. Once again, as I said before, we could not discern the actual apps that people were using, rather the background Android applications that were being used at the time. Second is to track burstiness over time to catch stress spikes around exams or deadlines. Unfortunately, we did not have timestamp data about when exactly this burstiness was recorded, so we're not really sure how that affects it, and also using newer data on and more data on iOS um, and other alternative operating systems for cell phones. But in closing, thank you so much for listening, and on behalf of me, Alec, Gavin, and Jay, we'd like to thank you for having us.